The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Violet Hunter knew this because she had read it on a Tuesday, and then again on Wednesday, and then once more, carefully, slowly, with her forefinger tracing each line. On Thursday morning, by the narrow window of her rented room in Montague Street, while the rain came down in that particular London way. Not heavily, not dramatically, but with a kind of patient insistence, as though it had nowhere else to be, and no intention of leaving before it had thoroughly soaked everything worth soaking. She smoothed the letter against the windowsill. It was good paper, heavier than she was accustomed to receiving. The address at the top read, "The Copper Beeches, near Winchester, Hampshire," written in a hand that was confident and slightly too large, the hand of a man who considered legibility a courtesy he extended to others rather than a discipline he imposed upon himself. The signature at the bottom, Jeffro Rucastle, had that same generous, unhurried quality. A man at ease, a man with space to spare. Outside, a cart horse shifted its weight on the wet cobbles below, and the sound came up through the glass, the soft complaint of iron shoes on stone, the creak of a harness, the driver's low murmur to the animal as he waited for the traffic ahead to clear. Violet barely heard it. She was reading the final paragraph again. "You will be required, upon occasion, to wear a dress of a particular shade of electric blue, which will be provided for you. You will be required, upon occasion, to sit in a certain chair, facing a certain window, for periods of no more than 2 hours at a time, while I relate to you such amusing stories or observations as may occur to me. You will be required to cut your hair, a circumstance I mention directly, as I have found that young women prefer frankness on this point to discovering the requirement after arrival." She lifted her finger from the page. The salary was £120 per annum. She had, in her previous position with the Fairfax family, earned 48. She had left the Fairfaxes, or rather, the Fairfaxes had left England, departing for Portugal with neither warning nor a character reference prepared, which was the sort of thing that happened to governesses with a frequency that the profession had long since learned to accept, with the same stoic resignation. It applied to cold schoolrooms and inadequate coal allowances. £120 was not a salary. It was an argument. It was a figure designed to make a young woman stop asking questions. Violet was not, by nature, a young woman who stopped asking questions. She had been a governess since the age of 19, and she was now 23. And in those 4 years she had developed a certain practical clarity about the world. That generosity without explanation was rarely either generous or without explanation. That men who were jovial in letters were not always jovial in person, and that the most important part of any document was the section that made you uncomfortable. She had read the letter again because she wanted to be sure she was uncomfortable for the right reasons. The dress, that was odd, certainly. The sitting at the window, stranger still. But it was the hair that returned to her, the way a sound returns to a room after it seems to have faded. You will be required to cut your hair. Not it. Would be preferred, or it would be appreciated, but required. The same word used for the dress and the chair. The language of conditions, not requests. Her hair was a rich, abundant chestnut, and it fell, when unbound, well past her shoulders. She had always been quietly proud of it. in the way that practical young women permit themselves one small vanity and defend it with great practicality. Several of the children she had taught had liked to sit beside her in the evenings, while she read aloud and reach up to touch it, the way small hands reach for anything warm and nearby. She had never minded. She folded the letter along its original crease. She had been careful not to introduce new ones, and held it for a moment in both hands. The rain continued its patient work on the glass. Montague Street was not an unpleasant address. It occupied that particular tier of London respectability that is neither comfortable enough to feel settled, nor precarious enough to feel dramatic. A tier populated largely by junior clerks, widows of modest inheritance, music teachers, and governesses between positions. The house itself belonged to a Mrs. Penhaligon, who kept it in a condition of severe tidiness and provided breakfast, but not dinner and hot water, but only between 7 and 9 in the morning, a restriction she enforced with the quiet authority of someone who has found that flexibility in small matters leads inexorably to chaos in large ones. Violet's room was on the second floor, east-facing, which meant it received the morning light when there was morning light to receive, and on overcast days received instead a particular quality of grey that was not unpleasant if one was accustomed to reading by it. She had arranged her few possessions with the efficiency of someone who had moved often enough to know which objects were worth unpacking, and which were better left in the trunk. Her books on the small table by the window, her writing case on the desk, her extra shawl on the hook behind the door, and the miniature of her mother on the mantelpiece, positioned at a slight angle so that it caught whatever light was available. She had been in this room for 6 weeks. She had answered 11 advertisements. She had received 3 responses, attended 2 interviews, and been offered 1 position, which had been withdrawn when the family discovered, 3 days after extending the offer, that they could secure a French governess for less money, French being considered, in certain households, a more fashionable qualification than competence. The letter from Mr. Rucastle had arrived on a Tuesday. It had been answered on Friday, not accepted, not refused, but answered with a request for clarification on several points, including the matter of references, the ages and number of the children to be taught, and whether the cutting of the hair was truly a firm requirement or merely a strong preference. Mr. Rucastle had replied by return post, which itself was notable, the speed of it, with a letter equally long and considerably more charming than the first, explaining that the Rucastle household contained 1 young child, that references could be provided and requested in the usual manner, that the salary was firm and the position was immediate, and that yes, regrettably, the hair was indeed a firm requirement, though he quite understood if this made the position unattractive, as he had always believed in being forthright about inconveniences. He had added, in a postscript, "My wife and I are simple people, Miss Hunter, who have suffered something of a difficult year, and find that small regularities comfort us greatly. I ask for these conditions not out of eccentricity, I assure you, but out of a domestic necessity, which I am not at liberty to explain by letter. I hope you will trust that what seems strange at a distance often seems far less so when one is present and settled." It was a good postscript. It was the kind of postscript written by a man who understood that the best way to address a woman's reasonable suspicion was to acknowledge it warmly, and then redirect her attention to his own reasonableness. Violet had read it twice. Then she had set both letters on the desk, made herself a cup of tea with the small spirit lamp she kept for precisely this kind of thinking, and sat down to consider the matter properly. The problem was not the strangeness. Violet had encountered strangeness before, households with rules about which chairs could be sat in, and which doors couldn't be opened, families who required that the governess take her meals alone, or who kept the drawing-room locked on Sundays, or who had a particular arrangement with the boot-boy that no one discussed and everyone observed. The English country house, in Violet's experience, ran on a rich substrate of unspoken rules and inherited peculiarities, and the governess who expected logic from these arrangements would quickly exhaust herself. The problem was the pattern, not the dress considered alone, not the chair considered alone, not even the hair, which was sufficiently unusual to merit attention on its own merits. It was the three together, and the specific phrasing, upon occasion. Not every day or on Tuesdays or in the mornings, upon occasion, which meant at someone's discretion, which meant Violet would never know on any given morning whether this would be a day when the blue dress was required, the chair was required, the window was required. She would be, in some functional sense, on call, costumed, on demand, positioned, the word that came to her, and she set it aside immediately, because it was too large a word for what might yet be a perfectly explicable situation was displayed. She did not pick the word up again, but she noticed that she had thought it. She finished her tea. The rain had softened by then, dropping from its patient insistence to a fine and almost silky drizzle that caught the lamplight from the street below and turned it briefly to something almost beautiful. A woman passed on the pavement with a basket over one arm, moving quickly, her boots clicking an even rhythm on the wet stone. A child ran to catch up with her. The ordinary evening assembled itself outside the window with no concern for Violet's deliberations. She picked up both letters. She read the final paragraph of the first one a fourth time. Then she did something she had not previously considered doing. She got up, went to her writing case, and took out a fresh sheet of paper. She wasn't writing to accept the position. She was writing to Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, whose name she had seen mentioned twice in the newspapers, once in connection with a matter involving a missing shipment of documents, and once, more recently, in a brief paragraph about the resolution of an affair in the city, that the paper declined to specify further, but described as having been handled with characteristic discretion. She had filed these mentions away without any particular intention of using them, the way one files away the location of a fire escape, not because one anticipates needing it, but because the information seems the sort that one ought to have. She wrote carefully, with her best pen. In the neat, unhurried hand she used for correspondence, she wished to be taken seriously. She described the offer. She described the conditions. She described the hair, and the dress, and the chair by the window, and the phrase upon occasion. She described the salary, and what the salary implied. She described the postscript, and what the postscript seemed designed to accomplish. Then she paused, held the pen just above the paper, and added one final line. I am not a fanciful woman, Mr. Holmes, and I am aware that I may be attaching significance to what is, in the end, merely the domestic eccentricity of a Hampshire family. But I should like your opinion before I accept or decline, as I cannot quite shake the feeling that the letter's conditions are not what they appear to be, and I find I would rather be thought overcautious than discover afterward that I should have been more so. She sanded the letter, folded it, and addressed the envelope. She left it on the writing case for the night. In the morning, she posted it on her way to buy bread, in the red pillar box on the corner of Montague Street, without ceremony or second thought, the way one does a thing once one has decided to do it, and sees no further purpose in deliberating. The bread was fresh. The rain had stopped. The morning was grey and cool and entirely ordinary. She walked back to the house with the loaf under her arm and the slight but specific feeling of someone who has moved a weight from one place to another, and is not yet sure whether they have improved the arrangement, but is fairly confident they have done the right thing. It is worth pausing here, just briefly, just for a moment, to consider what it meant, in the autumn of 1891, to be a governess. Not a bad governess, not an unhappy one, but simply a governess, that particular creature of the Victorian household who occupied, with a precision that would have been impressive had it not been so exhausting, a position that was neither servant nor family, neither above stairs nor fully below, but suspended somewhere in the architectural middle of the house, like a well-read ghost, essential to the daily mechanics of the place, but invisible to its social geography. A governess ate with the family, or she did not. She was introduced to guests, or she was not. She was consulted about the children's progress, or she was thanked and dismissed and not consulted. She was, in some households, treated with warmth and real affection. In others, she was treated with the careful courtesy extended to any domestic arrangement that one wishes not to examine too closely. The same courtesy one extends to a piece of furniture one has inherited and not yet decided whether to keep. She was educated, often more so than the family employing her. She was accomplished. She could speak French or German, or play the pianoforte, or teach the rudiments of geography, history, arithmetic, literature, natural philosophy, and the proper way to hold a pen. She was, in almost every practical sense, a professional woman operating in a world that did not quite have a category for professional women, and had therefore invented one that paid as little as possible and asked as much as could reasonably be asked. The salary of £120 was, in this context, not merely generous, it was implausible. Violet had known this from the moment she read it. She'd simply wanted to understand why before she decided what to do about it. That was, in its quietest way, the most important thing about Violet Hunter. She was a young woman who wanted to understand things before she acted on them, and who had enough self-possession to sit with her own discomfort until it told her something useful. The letter from Baker Street arrived 2 days later. It was short, and it was signed simply S.H., and it said, "Your instincts are sound. Kindly do not accept or decline until you have visited at your earliest convenience. 221B Baker Street, any morning before noon." Violet read it once. Then she put on her coat and hat, tucked her umbrella under her arm, and went to find a cab. The cab turned into Baker Street at 10:30 on a Friday morning, and Violet Hunter, who had been watching the city assemble itself outside the window with the focused attention of someone who finds observation a useful substitute for anxiety, noted the following: that the street was quieter than she had expected, that the houses were tall and identical in the way of streets that have decided on a personality and intend to maintain it, and that number 221B was distinguished from its neighbours by almost nothing at all except a brass plate beside the door that had been polished recently, and a first-floor window from which, even at this hour, a thin thread of smoke rose, with the unhurried patience of something that had been burning for quite some time. She paid the cab driver, stepped down onto the pavement, and stood for a moment in the thin October light. The street smelled of damp stone and coal smoke, and, faintly, from somewhere nearby, bread. A sparrow landed on the curb 3 feet from her boot, regarded her with the frank indifference of a London sparrow, and departed. Somewhere above the rooftops, a church bell marked the half-hour with 2 soft strokes that dissolved almost immediately into the general hum of the city. Wheels and voices, and the distant percussion of a hammer on something metallic, all of it blending into that particular London undertone that was not quite silence, and not quite noise, but something companionable between the two. Violet straightened her gloves, lifted the brass knocker, and knocked. The door was opened by a woman of middle years and considerable composure, who looked at Violet with the expression of someone who has answered this door a great many times, and has long since stopped being surprised by who appears on the other side of it. "Miss Hunter," the woman said, which was not a question. "Yes," said Violet. "They're expecting you. Mind the second step. It's been loose a fortnight, and himself hasn't gotten round to it yet." She stepped back to admit Violet into a narrow hallway that smelled of beeswax and tobacco, and, just beneath both, something warm and flowery that suggested Mrs. Hudson, for this was undoubtedly Mrs. Hudson, had been baking, and considered it no business of anyone else's. The staircase was papered in a pattern of dark green and cream that had been fashionable some years ago, and had settled, since then, into a kind of dignified shabbiness, the sort that suggests not neglect, but simply a great deal of living conducted in proximity. The banister was solid oak, worn smooth at the curve where hands had gripped it 10,000 times. The carpet runner was a deep burgundy, faded along its centre to a softer rose, and it absorbed Violet's footsteps as she followed Mrs. Hudson upwards so completely that she felt, briefly, as though she were moving without making any impression on the house at all. She avoided the second step. Mrs. Hudson knocked once at the sitting-room door, a brisk, proprietary knock, the knock of someone who considers the room partly hers, on the grounds of having cleaned it, opened it, without waiting for an answer, and said, "Miss Hunter? Mr. Holmes?" in the tone of a woman who has introduced a great many people to one another, and feels the ceremony requires no elaboration. Then she withdrew, pulling the door nearly but not entirely closed behind her, which Violet suspected was a habit rather than an oversight. The sitting-room was warm. That was the first thing. The warmth of it, the specific warmth of a room that has had a fire burning in it since early morning, and has fully absorbed that warmth into its walls and curtains and furniture, so that it greets you not as a temperature, but as an atmosphere. The fire itself was moderate and well tended. The coals settled into a steady, orange-hearted glow that needed no attention and asked for none. The room was also, it must be said, extraordinarily cluttered. Not dirty, not in any way that suggested disorder of spirit or intention, but occupied, thoroughly and specifically occupied, by the evidence of a mind that had been applied to a great many things simultaneously, and saw no particular reason to tidy the results. There were papers on the mantelpiece, and papers on the desk, and papers weighted with a human skull that Violet chose to note without comment. There were books, many books, arranged in no system she could immediately identify, though she suspected a system existed and was simply not designed for visitors. There was a violin case propped against the wall beside the window with the easy familiarity of an instrument that is played often and put away seldom. There were, on the table beside the fire, the remnants of breakfast, a teapot, 2 cups, a rack of toast, of which one piece had been eaten, and one had not, alongside a folded newspaper, a magnifying glass, and what appeared to be a small pile of correspondence that had been opened, read, and set down with the focused carelessness of a man who intends to return to it shortly. Near the window, in a basket chair, angled to receive both the light and the warmth of the fire, sat a man who was long and lean and very still, in the manner of someone who is thinking rather than resting. The stillness of concentration, not relaxation. He had a pipe, currently unlit, resting between 2 fingers, and he was looking at Violet with the kind of attention that one usually associates with examination, rather than greeting, though his expression was not unkind. "Miss Hunter," said Sherlock Holmes, "you took a cab from Montague Street. You've been reconsidering the position since posting your letter, but the reconsideration has not produced a conclusion. If it had, you would not have come. Sit down, please. Watson, the tea." From behind Violet, she turned slightly, came the sound of a chair being shifted, and then the comfortable, unhurried movement of a man who is entirely at home and entirely content to be useful. Dr. Watson was broader than Holmes and considerably warmer in appearance, the kind of face that one trusts immediately, without being able to specify why. Perhaps because it is the face of someone who has seen a great deal and chosen, on balance, to remain cheerful about humanity. He smiled at Violet with the genuine, uncomplicated welcome of a good host and lifted the teapot. "Milk?" he said. "Please," said Violet, and sat down. There is a particular quality to being listened to by Sherlock Holmes that several people, attempting to describe it afterward, had compared to various unsettling things, being pinned to a board, being read like a document, being sorted into a category before one had finished speaking. Violet found it was not like any of these things. It was more like being in a room with someone who was genuinely interested in what you were saying, and who had the unusual discipline to demonstrate this interest through silence rather than response. He did not nod sympathetically or make small, encouraging sounds. He simply listened with those pale, attentive eyes, and that absolute stillness, and the effect was, Violet searched for the word, clarifying. She found herself choosing her words more carefully than usual, not because she felt judged, but because the quality of the attention seemed to call for the quality of the description. She told him everything in the order it had happened. The first letter, the salary, the conditions, the dress and the chair and the hair. The second letter and its careful postscript. Her own 4 readings of the final paragraph. The specific discomfort she had been unable to name until she had named it to herself at last, displayed, and then set aside as too large. Holmes did not speak until she had finished. Then he said, "The hair." "Yes," said Violet. "Describe your hair, please." Violet paused for only a moment, Chestnut, fairly abundant. Long, it falls below my shoulders when unbound. Holmes set down his unlit pipe. And the salary is £120 per annum. Yes, for a governess with one child to teach. A young child, he said. He did not specify the age. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who does not know what to say, but the quiet of someone assembling pieces that have already been selected. Then he said, "Watson?" Said Watson, who had settled into his own chair on the other side of the fire with his tea and the expression of a man following a story he finds interesting. "A woman?" Holmes said, not to Watson exactly, but in the general direction of the fire, with chestnut hair of notable abundance, kept from public view, for reasons a family declines to explain by letter, at a remote Hampshire property, and a governess hired at an extraordinary salary to dress, sit, and be positioned, upon occasion, near a window, facing outward. He paused. Someone, he said, was meant to be seen from outside. The fire settled with a soft shift of coals. Watson set down his cup quietly. Violet felt something in her chest move, not fear, precisely, but its more useful cousin, recognition. The feeling of a word arriving for something that has been sitting wordless for days. "Not me," she said. "No," Holmes agreed. "Not you, precisely. A version of you. Someone who, at a distance, through a window, dressed in a particular way, with a particular kind of hair, might be taken for someone else." He picked up his pipe again and turned it between his fingers. The question worth asking is not why they want this performance. The question is, who is the audience? Watson refilled the teacups without being asked, which Violet would later recall as one of the small things she liked best about that morning, the way the ordinary domestic gestures continued alongside the extraordinary ones, the tea poured and the toast rack there and the fire doing its steady work, all of it saying, in its quiet way, that this was simply a room where problems were brought and addressed, and that the bringing of one did not make the room any less warm. Holmes had risen at some point during his own thinking, and drifted to the window, not in the pacing manner of a man agitated, but in the drifting manner of a man whose thought processes benefit from a slight change of position. He stood with his hands clasped behind him, looking down at Baker Street, where the morning traffic had thickened slightly, a coal cart moving slowly, 2 women with shopping baskets, a boy running with a newspaper under his arm. "The conditions are designed," he said, still looking outward, "to make you behave in a way that is regular and predictable. The dress is a costume, the chair by the window is a stage, the cutting of the hair is to complete a resemblance." He turned. "Someone in that house doesn't want something seen, and the method of concealment involves substituting you for that something, for someone, at intervals that will satisfy any external observer who might come looking." "An observer who knows the person I meant to resemble," Violet said. "Who knows her at a distance," Holmes said. "Well enough to be satisfied by silhouette and colour, but not well enough, or not permitted closely enough, to verify the detail." He paused. "A suitor, perhaps. A solicitor. A friend who has been told the occupant of the house is well and present, and not to worry." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the fire and the faint outer sounds of the street. "Then there is someone else in the house," Violet said. "Someone they are hiding." "Someone they need to keep hidden," Holmes said, while maintaining the appearance that she is not hidden at all, that she is simply at home, visible occasionally From the lane? Quite well. No need to call. He came back to his chair and sat down in it in that abrupt, folding way he had, as though the thinking portion of the exercise was complete, and the sitting was simply the most efficient available response. My advice, he said, is to accept the position. Watson looked up from his tea. And to observe, Holmes continued, without inflection, as though this were the most natural recommendation in the world. The house, its rhythms, which doors are kept closed and which are opened, whether there are rooms that the staff avoids or that you are directed away from, whether you hear sounds that are not accounted for, whether anyone, any member of the household or any visitor, looks at you and then corrects their expression. "You want me to go?" Violet said, "into a house that is keeping someone hidden and to observe." "I want you," Holmes said, with the faintest adjustment of tone that was, she would come to understand, his closest equivalent to a smile, "to do what you were, I suspect, already considering doing. I am simply suggesting that you do it with a purpose, and that you do not do it alone." He glanced at Watson. "We will remain available. Any letter forwarded through Watson will reach me within a day." Violet looked at her teacup for a moment. Outside, the Baker Street sparrows were conducting some small dispute on the window ledge, their voices quick and indignant. The coal cart had moved on. The church bell marked 11 with a single, soft stroke. "Very well," she said. She said it the way she had posted the letter, without ceremony, without second-guessing, in the manner of someone who has already decided and simply needed the conversation to catch up. Holmes nodded once, which was, she would come to understand, his version of good. She left Baker Street at 11:30, in a cab Watson had hailed for her from the doorstep, with the efficient kindness of a man who anticipates practical needs. She had the Rucastle letters in her bag, and the address of a stationer's shop in Bloomsbury, where Holmes had told her she could purchase a particular kind of writing paper that was useful for correspondence one wished to be discreet about. She had the firm, quiet feeling of a decision made and understood. She also had, tucked into the pocket of her coat, a small card on which Watson had written his address in his round, legible hand, and below it a single line in Holmes's considerably less legible one: "Send word from Winchester before you go to the house. S.H." She read it once, folded it, kept it. The cab moved south through the October morning, and London went about its business on either side. The costermongers and the crossing sweepers, the hansom cabs and the delivery boys, the great indifferent machinery of the city, turning and turning as it always did, whether anyone was watching or not. Violet Hunter watched, because watching was what she did, and because it seemed to her that paying attention was, in the end, the most useful thing a person could bring to any situation. The Copper Beeches awaited. She was ready. The train to Winchester left Waterloo at 9:07, and Violet Hunter was on it, with 12 minutes to spare, which was exactly the margin she preferred, enough time to find her seat, arrange her bag, and settle into the particular stillness of a journey begun without hurry. The carriage was not crowded. A clergyman with a large black bag occupied the far corner, and fell asleep before the train had cleared the station, his chin dropping to his chest with the practised efficiency of a man who has learned to sleep on railways the way sailors learn to sleep at sea. Across from Violet, a woman of perhaps 50, with a market basket on her lap, looked out of the window with the expression of someone returning to a place she knows well and has complicated feelings about. Neither paid Violet any attention, which suited her entirely. She watched London dissolve. It did not happen all at once. London never ended all at once. It frayed, gradually, the dense brick terraces thinning to suburbs, the suburbs thinning to the scattered outposts of the city's ambition, the gasworks and the tile yards and the modest rows of new houses that were always being built on the edges of everything, pushing the countryside back by increments the way a tide pushes sand. Then, slowly, the green appeared, first in patches, between embankments, and then in wider stretches, until the city was simply gone, and the fields were there, grey-green in the October light, the hedgerows dark and full, and the trees just beginning their slow, amber undressing. Violet had grown up in the country, and she had spent the last 4 years in London, and she had reached the conclusion that she was the kind of person who could live in either place without feeling she had made a mistake, which she considered a useful quality. She took out her notebook and wrote, in the neat, compressed hand she used for practical things. Arrive Winchester approximately 11. Hire trap to Copper Beeches. Ask at the station inn. Observe the approach to the house. Note the lane and any buildings visible from it. Note the windows. She underlined windows. Then she closed the notebook and watched the countryside move past, and allowed herself the uncomplicated pleasure of a train journey on an October morning, with nothing required of her for the next 2 hours except to sit still and breathe. Winchester received her with the measured dignity of a city that has been important for a very long time and has no need to announce this to anyone. The station was modest, as cathedral cities' stations often are, the cathedral itself being, architecturally speaking, a difficult act to follow. The air outside was immediately and noticeably different from London's. Cleaner, with a coolness in it that carried the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves, and, somewhere beneath both, the faint sweetness of something fermenting in an orchard. Apples, perhaps, the last of the season, going softly back to the ground. Violet stood on the station forecourt for a moment and breathed it in. The trap she hired was driven by a man of approximately 60, who gave his name as Amos and offered no further personal information, which Violet respected. The horse was a steady bay mare, who clearly knew the roads and required no particular guidance, picking her way through the town and out along the Winchester Road with the calm competence of an animal that has made this journey many times and expects no surprises. "Copper Beeches?" Amos said once when she gave him the address. "Yes," said Violet. He nodded, made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite its opposite, and said nothing further. Violet, who had learned to read the silences of country people as fluently as she read city ones, noted the sound and filed it away. The road south from Winchester was good, broad and well maintained, with the kind of surface that spoke of regular traffic and a parish council that took its responsibilities seriously. On either side, the Hampshire countryside arranged itself in the unhurried, deep-rooted way of land that has been farmed for centuries. Fields bounded by thick hedges, copses of beech and oak standing in the middle distance, a farmhouse here and there, with its yard and outbuildings clustered about it, like children around a parent. The sky was high and pale, the clouds moving slowly from the west, and the light had that thin, travelling quality of autumn light that makes everything look slightly more itself, the colours deeper, the shadows longer, the whole landscape faintly illuminated as though from within. Violet sat with her hands in her lap and watched the road, and thought about windows. The Copper Beeches announced itself first by its trees. They were extraordinary. She had not expected that, though the name should have prepared her. 4 great copper beeches stood along the front of the property, their branches spreading wide and low armed their foliage. Even now, in October's thinning, was that deep, particular reddish bronze that is less like a colour than like a quality of light caught and held in leaf form. They caught the pale morning sun and gave it back warmer than they received it, and the effect was of standing near something quietly, steadily burning. The house behind them was handsome and well proportioned, a country manor of the middling sort, neither grand nor modest, built in the previous century, and maintained, it appeared, with care, if not lavishness. Red brick, white-painted windows, a gravel drive that curved from the lane to the front door in a gentle arc, a kitchen garden visible to one side, its beds turned for winter, a stable block at the rear, its doors standing open, rooks in the tall elms to the east, their voices carrying across the stillness with that particular rook authority that sounds like commentary on everything and endorsement of nothing. Violet looked at the windows. Ground floor, 3 to the left of the front door, 2 to the right, all of normal proportion, all with their curtains open. First floor, 5 windows, evenly spaced. One of these, the second from the left at the far end of the wing, had its curtain drawn, though it was nearly noon. She looked at it for 2 seconds, no more. Then she looked away. Amos set her trunk down at the front door, accepted his fare with a nod, and departed without ceremony. Violet stood on the front step with her bag and her umbrella, and the composed expression she had developed over 4 years of arriving at houses where she was expected, but not, precisely, welcomed. The door opened before she could knock. Mr. Jeffro Rucastle was exactly as his letters had suggested, and therefore slightly more alarming in person. He was a large man, not merely tall, but expansive, occupying space with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never been asked to make himself smaller. He had a broad, well-fed face, with small, bright eyes that moved quickly despite the general impression of ease, and a smile that arrived promptly and stayed reliably. The smile of a man who has decided that geniality is the most efficient policy and applies it consistently. His coat was good. His handshake, when he extended it, was warm and firm and slightly too long. "Miss Hunter," he said, with every appearance of genuine pleasure. "Excellent, excellent timing. We were just thinking about you, weren't we, my dear?" This last was addressed to the woman who appeared behind him in the hallway, Mrs. Rucastle, who was younger than her husband by perhaps 15 years, and considerably quieter in every respect. She was pale and thin, with the kind of careful stillness that can mean either great self-possession or great unhappiness, and Violet, who had learned to read women in houses as carefully as she read anything, did not yet know which this was. She smiled at Violet with a smile that reached her eyes, and then retreated from them quickly, like a small animal that has looked out from cover and thought better of it. "We're very pleased you've come," Mrs. Rucastle said. Her voice was soft and carried the faint inflection of the West Country. "Thank you," said Violet. "I'm very glad to be here." This was not precisely true, but It was the appropriate thing to say, and Violet said it with the practiced warmth of someone who has learned that the appropriate thing, delivered with genuine pleasantness, is usually its own kind of truth. The hallway was wide and well lit, with a good turkey carpet and a staircase of polished oak rising to the upper floor. It smelled of beeswax and cut flowers. There were chrysanthemums in a vase on the hall table, white and faintly bitter-scented, the last of them from the garden probably, and wood smoke from a fire somewhere deeper in the house, and something else, faint and beneath everything else, that Violet could not immediately name. Something close and slightly stale, the smell of a room that is kept shut. She noted it. She said nothing. Mr. Rucastle showed her the ground floor with the expansive good humour of a man proud of his property and untroubled by the possibility that his guest might find anything unusual in it. The drawing-room, the dining-room, the library, all pleasant, all well-appointed, all perfectly ordinary. The library had good shelves and a notable gap on the third shelf from the floor, east wall, where 3 books had been removed and not replaced. Violet could see the lighter rectangle on the wood where they had stood. She noted it. She said nothing. There was a door at the end of the library corridor, heavy, with a newer lock, its brass fittings bright against the older wood of the frame, that Mr. Rucastle walked past without acknowledging. He did not walk past it quickly. He simply walked past it in the manner of a man who has trained himself to find it unremarkable. Violet's eyes moved to the door and away again in the same breath. She noted it. Her room was on the first floor, east wing, pleasant, south-facing, with a window that overlooked the kitchen garden, and, beyond it, the meadow that ran to the tree line. A good bed, a writing desk, a wardrobe of adequate size. On the chair beside the bed, neatly folded, was a dress. Electric blue, good wool, cut for a woman of approximately Violet's height and build. It was not her dress. It fit her almost exactly. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at it. Then she unpacked her trunk with systematic efficiency, hung her own dresses in the wardrobe, set her books on the desk, placed the miniature of her mother on the mantelpiece at its customary angle, and put the notebook and pen where she could reach them easily. She looked at the blue dress once more. Then she went to the window and looked out at the meadow, and beyond it the trees, and beyond them the pale October sky. And she thought about the second window on the left, first floor, west wing, with its curtain still drawn at noon. She thought about what Holmes had said. Someone they need to keep hidden, while maintaining the appearance that she is not hidden at all. Outside, the rooks continued their commentary in the elms. The Copper Beeches moved very slightly in a wind Violet could not feel from inside, their bronze leaves catching the light and releasing it again, over and over, with the patient indifference of things that have been here long before the house, and intend to remain long after. She was here now. She would begin to look. The first week at the Copper Beeches passed the way. First weeks in new households always passed, in the careful, mutual study of strangers who must learn to occupy the same space without collision. Violet taught the child in the mornings. His name was Edward, and he was 6 years old, and he was one of the most unsettling children Violet had encountered in 4 years of professional experience with children, which was a category that included a boy in Kensington who had attempted to post the family cat, a girl in Bayswater who had bitten 3 governesses in succession, and considered this a personal record worth defending, and twins in Hampstead who communicated exclusively through a system of signals they declined to explain to adults. Edward Rucastle did not bite, or signal, or attempt to post anything. He simply watched. He had his father's small, bright eyes, and none of his father's performed warmth, and he watched. Violet with the flat, evaluating attention of someone considerably older, as though he were taking notes on her for a purpose he had not yet disclosed. He was also, she discovered, genuinely clever. This made him more unsettling, not less. She taught him his letters and his numbers, and read to him from a natural history book that he preferred above all others, particularly the sections on insects, which he studied with an intensity that Violet chose to find educational rather than concerning. He was a quiet pupil, which she appreciated. He asked questions that were occasionally very good, and occasionally very strange. On the third day, he asked her, without preamble, whether she had heard anything in the night. "I sleep quite soundly," Violet said, which was not entirely true. Edward looked at her for a moment. Then he returned to his insects. She noted the question. She said nothing further. The blue dress was required for the first time on Thursday. Mr. Rucastle appeared at the schoolroom door at 2:30 in the afternoon, with his reliable smile and the information that he had a story he particularly wished to tell, and would she mind terribly sitting with him in the drawing-room for an hour. He said this with the easy confidence of a man who does not anticipate being told no, which was, Violet had come to understand, his habitual mode. He did not anticipate resistance because he had arranged his household so that resistance was structurally difficult. There was always a smile, always a reasonable explanation, always the sense that to object would be to misunderstand his perfectly innocent intentions. Violet changed into the blue dress in her room. It fit her well. Someone had measured carefully, or had a very accurate memory of the measurements they needed. She twisted her shortened hair. She had had it cut in Winchester before coming, a decision she had made calmly and efficiently, and mourned only slightly in private, into a neat arrangement at the back of her head, and looked at herself briefly in the glass above the washstand. She looked like herself, mostly, but she looked like herself arranged to resemble someone else, and she had the curious feeling that the difference was visible only to her. She went downstairs. The drawing-room chair was positioned, as she had expected, facing the south window, the window that looked out over the front drive and the lane beyond it, framed on either side by the great Copper Beeches. The afternoon light came through it directly, which meant that anyone outside in the lane or beyond the gate would see her silhouette clearly, and her features not at all. Mr. Rucastle sat behind her and slightly to the left, angled so that he could watch her profile while appearing to address the room generally. He told his story, something about a hunting trip in Scotland, mildly amusing, well practiced, the story of a man who has told it before, and knows where the good parts are. His wife sat in the corner with her sewing, and said nothing. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the quarter hours with a soft silver chime. Violet sat in the chair and looked at the lane and listened to the story with the attentive expression she had perfected for situations that required the appearance of attention while the mind was engaged elsewhere. There was a man in the lane. He was perhaps 30, simply dressed, standing at a slight distance from the gate with the stillness of someone who is trying not to appear to be watching, but is watching. He was not looking at the house in general. He was looking at the window, at the silhouette in the window, at the blue dress. He stood there for perhaps 4 minutes. Then he turned and walked away down the lane, and his walk had in it something that Violet, watching carefully, identified as relief. He had come to check. He had seen the blue dress, the chestnut hair, the figure in the window. He had been satisfied. Violet sat in the chair until Mr. Rucastle concluded his story, thanked him pleasantly, and went upstairs. She wrote 3 lines in her notebook, in the small, compressed hand she used for things she did not want to casually read. Man in lane. 30, approximately. Watching window. Left satisfied. Knows the person I am meant to be. She underlined the last line. Then she went to the window of her own room and looked across to the west wing. The curtain was still drawn, but as she watched, it moved, very slightly, the way a curtain moves when someone standing behind it shifts their weight. Not wind. There was no wind that afternoon. Someone was there. Violet stood at her window for a long moment. Then she reached out and, with 2 fingers, turned the latch of her own window to the half-open position, not open, not closed, but precisely halfway, at an angle that could be seen from the west wing if someone were watching. She left it there and went down to dinner. This was how it began. Not with a message, not with a note slipped under a door or a whispered word in a corridor. Those were the methods of stories, of melodrama, of the kind of communication that gets discovered and punished. Violet had understood from the moment she turned that latch that the woman in the west wing had survived this long by being careful, and that careless communication would end whatever fragile arrangement existed between them before it had properly started. So she used the language of small things. The window latch was the first word, half turned. I see you. I am watching. I know you are there. The second word was a ribbon, a narrow blue ribbon from her sewing case, left on the outside sill of her room's window on a morning when the air was still, positioned so it would not blow away, but could be seen from the west wing. She had worn it in her hair the previous afternoon, which meant anyone in the house who noticed it on the sill would assume it had simply been left there. The ribbon meant, I am not what they think I am. She did not know if she was understood. She did not know if the woman in the west wing was watching closely enough, or had enough freedom of movement to watch at all. She left the signals and waited, and continued to teach Edward his letters, and sit in the blue dress at the window when required, and smiled pleasantly at Mr. Rucastle's stories and Mrs. Rucastle's careful silences, and watched the house. The house had a rhythm, and Violet learned it. Mr. Rucastle left each morning at 10 for reasons he described variously as business, estate matters, and appointments, and returned each afternoon between 3 and 5. During his absence, the house relaxed slightly, not dramatically, not in any way that a casual observer would notice, but Violet noticed, because she was trained by now to notice the small adjustments that households make when their centers of gravity shift. Mrs. Rucastle moved more freely, spoke a little more easily with the housemaid, once stood at the kitchen garden gate for 20 minutes simply looking at the beds, with an expression Violet could not read from a distance. The housemaid was named Tola, or rather, her husband was named Tola, and she was called Mrs. Tola, and she kept the west wing corridor. This was the thing Violet had taken longest to establish, because it was established not by watching Mrs. Tola directly, but by watching where she was not. She was not in the east wing when she should have been, not in the kitchen at the hours when kitchen work was required, not available when Violet rang for hot water on 2 separate mornings. She was somewhere else, regularly and predictably, between the hours of 11 and 1, and the only somewhere else that accounted for her absence without explanation was the west wing. She brought meals. Violet was almost certain she brought meals. She tested this on a Thursday. At 11:40 she contrived to knead something from the linen cupboard at the end of the east corridor. A second pillowcase, she told Mrs. Rucastle, having spilled ink on her own, and walked the length of the corridor with her eyes open. The smell reached her before she had gone halfway. That same faint, shut-in smell from the first day, stronger now that she knew what to attend to, the smell of a room with one person in it and too few hours of open window. And beneath it, just barely, food. Something warm, recently carried. She got her pillowcase and returned to her room. She had not been able to see the west wing door directly from this angle, but she had established what she needed to establish. That evening, she rearranged the books on the shelf in the library. There were 3 volumes on the 3rd shelf that had clearly been placed there recently. She had noted the lighter wood behind them on the first day, the rectangle where older books had stood. She moved them each 1 position to the right, a shift of perhaps 4 inches total. Invisible to a casual eye, but unmistakable to anyone who knew where to look. The books were a volume of Tennyson, a Bradshaw's Railway Guide for the previous year, and a slim, brown-covered book of accounts that appeared to be household records from some years back. She did not open any of them. She moved them 4 inches to the right and went to bed. In the morning, the Bradshaw's was gone. Not the Tennyson, not the accounts book, just the Railway Guide, lifted cleanly from the shelf and not replaced. Violet stood in the library doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame. Then she went to the writing desk in her room, took out the plain paper Holmes had directed her to buy in Bloomsbury, and wrote. There is a woman in the west wing. She has some freedom of movement within the house, or someone brings her things and carries messages. She has taken a railway guide from the library. She knows the books were moved. She is watching me as carefully as I am watching her. I believe she knows I am not what I appear to be. I am going to find a way to speak to her directly, but not yet. The household's routine has 1 hour of reliable looseness between 11 and 1. That is when it will happen, when I am certain it is safe. I have not yet found the documents. I know approximately where they are not. I am looking. She folded the letter, addressed it to Watson at his practice on Queen Anne Street, as Holmes had instructed, and handed it to the postboy the following morning with a halfpenny for his trouble. Then she went back inside, where Edward was waiting with his natural history book and his flat, evaluating eyes. And the Copper Beeches stood in the drive, catching the October light, with their bronze and patient leaves, and somewhere in the west wing, a woman with her railway guide was making her own calculations, laying her own plans, waiting with the particular quality of patience that belongs to people who have been waiting a very long time and have learned to make something useful of it. The house continued its rhythm around them both. Neither of them broke it. Not yet. The letter reached Watson on a Saturday morning. He was at his desk in Queen Anne Street, attending to the paperwork that accumulated around a medical practice the way fog accumulated around London, quietly, persistently, and with no apparent intention of resolving itself without intervention. He had been meaning to address it for 3 days. He had addressed approximately a third of it. The remaining 2/3 regarded him from the corner of the desk with the patient reproach of things that know they will eventually be dealt with, and are content to wait. He opened Violet's letter, read it twice, and then went directly to Baker Street. Holmes was playing the violin when Watson arrived, not practicing, not performing, but thinking in the way that sometimes expressed itself as music. Long, slow phrases that moved without obvious destination through the sitting room, and meant, in Watson's experience, that something had been partially resolved and was being held up to the light. He did not stop when Watson entered. He finished the phrase, lowered the bow, and said, without turning, "She's found her." "She has," Watson said, and handed over the letter. Holmes read it standing, which he always did with correspondence that interested him, moving slightly as he read in the manner of a man whose thinking and his body are not quite separate operations. He reached the end, folded it once, and set it on the mantelpiece beside the skull. "The Bradshaws," he said. "The railway guide," Watson agreed. She took the railway guide and left the others. "She's planning to leave," Holmes said. "Or she was planning to leave before circumstances changed. Or she wants Miss Hunter to know that she has considered leaving, which is its own kind of message." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "The documents are in the study. I am almost certain of it. Rucastle is not a man who would leave them far from his immediate supervision. He is the kind of man who needs to know where his security is, at all hours. The study is his room. The documents are there." He turned. "We should go to Hampshire." "When?" Watson said. "Monday," Holmes said. "Tuesday at the latest. There is one more thing I need to establish here first." He picked up the violin again, which meant, Watson knew, that the conversation was not over, but had moved to a different room in Holmes's mind, one that did not require Watson's participation for the moment. Watson sat down, accepted the tea that Mrs. Hudson brought without being asked. She had an uncanny sense for these moments, arriving with the tray at precisely the point when Watson had settled, and Holmes had retreated into thought, and drank it by the fire, and felt the pleasant specific satisfaction of a man who is part of something that is going well. They travelled to Winchester on the Monday. Watson had suggested taking the early train, which left Waterloo at 7 and arrived before 9, giving them the full day. Holmes had agreed with the particular quality of agreement that meant he had already decided this independently, and was simply acknowledging that Watson's conclusion matched his own. They travelled in a first-class compartment, with Holmes's small travelling bag, and Watson's considerably larger one, and a copy of the Hampshire County Directory that Holmes had acquired from somewhere over the weekend, and annotated in pencil in the margins, with observations Watson could not fully read, but which appeared to concern property records, local solicitors, and the name Rucastle, appearing several times, with question marks of varying sizes. Holmes spent most of the journey reading. Watson spent most of it watching the countryside, which had deepened since October's turn. The trees nearly bare now, the fields a rich, exhausted brown, the sky the particular pewter of early November that sat low over the hills and gave everything a muffled interior quality, as though the landscape were thinking. They arrived in Winchester at 11 minutes to 9, hired a trap from the station yard, and drove not to the Copper Beeches, but into the town. Holmes's first call was on a solicitor. The firm was Cranley and Barker, established 1847, occupying a narrow building on the High Street, with the quiet permanence of a business that has survived long enough to stop needing to announce itself. The senior partner, a Mr. Barker, was a thin man in his 60s, with the cautious eyes of someone professionally accustomed to people wanting things he could not give them. And he received Holmes with the polite wariness of a man who has heard of Sherlock Holmes, and is not entirely certain whether to be reassured or alarmed by his presence. Holmes was charming, in the way he was occasionally charming when charm was the most efficient instrument available, direct, warm, slightly self-deprecating, and completely in control of the conversation from the first sentence. He explained that he was making inquiries on behalf of a client, that the matter concerned the estate of a Mr. Arthur Rucastle, deceased, and that he was particularly interested in the question of how an inheritance might be administered during a period of the beneficiary's incapacity. Mr. Barker was quiet for a moment. Arthur Rucastle, he said. The elder Mr. Rucastle's daughter, by his first marriage. Holmes said pleasantly, Miss Alice Rucastle, I believe she would be, 26? 27. Mr. Barker looked at his desk, then he looked at Holmes. Then he said carefully that the firm had been retained in connection with various Rucastle family matters over the years, but that client confidentiality naturally precluded. Naturally, Holmes said. I ask only this. Is there currently a living will or power of attorney instrument in connection with Miss Alice Rucastle's affairs? Mr. Barker was quiet. For 4 seconds. Watson counted them. There is, he said, executed some 18 months ago. In favour of her father. Another pause. Her stepfather, Mr. Jeffro Rucastle. On grounds of incapacity. On grounds of a nervous condition. Yes. Holmes thanked him warmly, shook his hand, and they were back on the High Street in under 20 minutes. Watson waited until they had turned the corner. He is administering her estate, he said. He has been administering it for 18 months, Holmes said, which means the income from it has been going... where? Not to Alice Rucastle, who is locked in a West Wing room. To the household, almost certainly. To Jeffro Rucastle's comfort and his good coats and his charming stories about Scotland. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the middle distance. The power of attorney was obtained on grounds of incapacity. But if she is not incapacitated, if she is simply being kept from appearing well, then the instrument is fraudulent and can be challenged. The documents, Watson said, the original will, the power of attorney instrument, perhaps letters, records of the income drawn, all of it in the study, because a man like Rucastle keeps his security close. Holmes glanced at Watson. Miss Hunter needs 2 things, access to those papers and a solicitor of her own, not Cranley and Barker, who are already retained by the other side, but someone else. He paused. I wrote to a colleague in Southampton yesterday. He will come to Winchester on Wednesday if we send word. Watson looked at him. You arranged a solicitor before we left London, he said. I arranged the possibility of a solicitor, Holmes said, with perfect innocence. There is a difference. Watson chose not to examine this distinction too closely. In the afternoon, they walked. This was Holmes's method in the country. Not the trap, not the hired horse, but walking, which allowed the kind of lateral, unhurried observation that faster travel precluded. They took the road south from Winchester toward the Copper Beeches, walking at a moderate pace on the grass verge. Holmes, with his coat collar turned up and his eyes moving steadily across the landscape in that particular way of his, not staring, not obviously looking, simply receiving. The Copper Beeches came into view from perhaps a quarter-mile away, the great trees visible above the hedge-line before the house itself appeared, their bronze autumn crowns catching what light there was in the pewter sky. Watson kept his eyes forward and his pace steady. Holmes slowed very slightly as the front gate came level with them, just long enough to observe the windows. Watson knew he was doing this without looking at him, and then continued, without breaking step. "West wing," Holmes said quietly when they had passed. "The curtained window," Watson said. "Second from the left, first floor, and the ground floor room directly below it. The curtains are not drawn, but the window latch is turned inward, which is the position for a room that is regularly entered from inside, but is not meant to appear locked from outside." He paused. "There is a door in the ground floor of the west wing that opens onto the kitchen garden. It will have a lock, but the lock will be secondary. The primary restraint is Rucastle's presence, his routine, his predictability. When he is absent, the lock is probably not tested." They walked on, past the tree line, to a point where the lane curved, and a stile gave access to a footpath across the meadow. Holmes stopped here and turned back to look at the house from distance, his eyes moving across it with the systematic patience of someone reading a document. "The study," he said, half to himself. "Ground floor, east side, facing the drive. 2 windows. The curtains are partially drawn, not for privacy, for habit. He works there in the mornings before he leaves." He was quiet for a moment. "There is a ground floor window at the east end, slightly below the others. A casement, not a sash. If it is the kind that opens outward on a simple latch." "Holmes," Watson said. "It will almost certainly be the kind that opens outward on a simple latch," Holmes said, with perfect composure, as though Watson had not spoken. "Country houses of that period and construction invariably have." "You are describing how to get into the building," Watson said. "I am describing how the building is constructed," Holmes said, "which is a purely architectural observation." He turned away from the house and began walking back toward Winchester. "Send word to Miss Hunter tonight. Tell her Wednesday. Tell her the 11 o'clock hour." Watson looked back once at the house, the Copper Beeches standing their patient watch at the gate, the pale windows, the one curtained room on the first floor of the west wing that held, behind its drawn cloth, a woman reading a borrowed railway guide and waiting. Then he turned and followed Holmes back down the lane. The note Watson sent that evening was brief, in accordance with Holmes's instructions. It read, "Wednesday, the 11 o'clock hour. Leave the library as it is. We will manage the rest." Double beneath this, in the smaller and considerably less legible hand that Watson had come to think of, as Holmes's written equivalent of thinking aloud, "The window latch, east end, ground floor. Leave it half-turned Tuesday night if you are able." S.H. Watson sealed the envelope and gave it to the inn's postboy, with instructions for the morning collection. Then he went to bed in the narrow, clean room the Winchester Inn provided, in a town that smelled of old stone and cold air, and the particular quiet of a cathedral city after dark. And he lay for a while, listening to the silence before sleep came, thinking, as he sometimes did, at the turning point of a case, about the strange and specific satisfaction of this work, which was not the satisfaction of action, but of alignment, of pieces fitting, of understanding arriving, of a woman in a locked room who did not yet know that Wednesday was coming. The inn sign creaked very softly in the night wind outside. Watson slept. Tuesday passed quietly. Violet taught Edward his letters in the morning, and read to him from the natural history book in the afternoon, and he listened with his usual flat attention, and asked at one point whether spiders felt their webs or only knew them by touch, which was either a very good question or a very strange one, and possibly both. She told him she believed it was both, that the web was an extension of the spider's sensing, that it felt the web, the way a person feels the floor beneath their feet, as information rather than sensation. Edward considered this for a moment, and then returned to his book without comment, which was, Violet had come to understand, his version of approval. In the evening, after dinner, she went to the library. She moved nothing on the shelves. She took a book, Tennyson, the one that remained, and sat in the chair nearest the east window and read for 40 minutes, which was a normal thing to do, and gave her a reason to be in the room at that hour. The fire had been banked for the night and gave off a low, steady warmth. The clock marked 9, then the quarter, then the half. At 9:20 she replaced the book on the shelf, wished Mr. and Mrs. Rucastle a pleasant good night in the hallway. Mr. Rucastle was in good humour, having apparently concluded some business correspondence to his satisfaction, and went upstairs. At 10:30, when the house had settled into its nighttime quiet and the last light under the toller's door had gone out, Violet went to the east end of the corridor, descended the back staircase to the ground floor, moved through the kitchen passage to the east parlour, and turned the latch of the east casement window to the half-open position. It took 11 seconds. She counted them. Then she went back upstairs, got into bed, and lay in the dark listening to the house breathe around her, the settling of old timbers, the faint wind in the Copper Beeches outside, the distant sound of an owl somewhere in the elms, and thought about Wednesday. Wednesday arrived with low cloud and the smell of rain not yet fallen, the kind of morning that holds its weather in reserve and releases it when it chooses. Mr. Rucastle came down to breakfast in his coat, which meant he was leaving early. He was cheerful in the specific way of a man who has made a decision and is satisfied with it, a decisiveness in his movements, a quality of resolution in the smile that was marginally less performed than usual. He mentioned, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, that he had a meeting in Winchester that would keep him until at least 3. Violet buttered her toast and said she hoped it would go well. He said he was sure it would. Left at 9:45. The sound of his trap on the gravel drive diminished down the lane, and the house, as it always did in his absence, adjusted itself quietly. At 11 o'clock precisely, Watson knocked at the front door. He presented himself to Mrs. Rucastle as Dr. John Watson, a physician, travelling through Hampshire and paying a brief call on behalf of a London colleague who had asked him to inquire after a Miss Alice Rucastle's health. He said this with the specific, warm authority of a doctor making a routine inquiry, the tone that combines professional concern with social ease, the tone that has been managing difficult conversations in drawing-rooms and at bedsides for 30 years, and has no intention of being deflected. Mrs. Rucastle went very still. She was standing in the hallway with a shawl over her arm, and she went still in the way of someone who has been expecting a thing for a long time, and is not, now that it has arrived, quite prepared for it. "I'm afraid," she said carefully, "that Miss Rucastle is not well enough for visitors." "Of course," Watson said with complete understanding. "I had anticipated that might be the case. I wonder, though, might I at least confirm for my colleague that she is comfortable and receiving proper care? A brief word with whoever attends her would be entirely sufficient." He smiled at Mrs. Rucastle with the warm, uncomplicated smile of a man who expects to be trusted, and usually is. She was wavering. Watson could see it, the conflict moving behind her careful eyes, the calculation of what Rucastle would say against the separate calculation of what she herself believed was right. It was at this moment that Violet appeared at the top of the stairs. She had timed it precisely, and she came down in the manner of someone who has just heard an arrival, and is curious, rather than anxious, pleasantly, ordinarily, in her ordinary dress, her shortened hair neatly arranged. "Mrs. Rucastle," she said, "shall I take the doctor to the morning room? I can sit with Edward if you need to speak privately." The offer was perfect. It gave Mrs. Rucastle a reason to move, a reason to decide, without the pressure of being directly asked to decide anything. It was the kind of social management that governesses learned quickly and never forgot. Make the desired path the easiest path. Mrs. Rucastle looked at Violet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Yes, please." Holmes came in through the east casement window at 11 minutes past 11. He had been in the kitchen garden since 10:30, which was not comfortable in November, but was, as he later told Watson, entirely adequate. He had watched the trap leave. He had watched Watson knock at the front door. He had given the household 4 minutes to consolidate itself in the front of the house, and then he had opened the east casement window, which was, as he had predicted, a simple outward opening latch, and stepped into the east parlour with the unhurried calm of a man entering a room he has every right to be in. The parlour was empty. The corridor beyond it was empty. He moved to the study. The study door was not locked. There was no reason for it to be locked during the day, with Rucastle present or recently departed. It was a large, well-furnished room with a partner's desk at its centre, and a set of mahogany filing drawers along the east wall, and a fireplace with a good mantel, and, on the mantel, a pair of Staffordshire dogs, regarding the room with identical expressions of serene indifference. The fire had been lit that morning and was still alive, giving the room a warmth and slight smokiness that smelled of cedar and old paper. Holmes went to the desk first. The top was clear. Correspondence dealt with and put away, in the manner of a man who has resolved his business that morning and is satisfied. The top drawer held the usual contents of a working desk: pen nibs, sealing wax, a small knife, a bottle of ink, a memorandum book with the current year's entries. Holmes opened the memorandum book, moved through it in 30 seconds, and set it down. The bottom drawer was locked. He looked at it for a moment. The lock was good, better than the rest of the furniture warranted, which was itself a kind of answer. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small case that Watson, had he been present, would have identified as the one Holmes occasionally brought to situations where locks needed to be addressed on short notice. 40 seconds. The drawer opened. Inside, a folded document, heavy paper, tied with red tape in the legal manner. A second document, thinner, with a solicitor's stamp on its cover. A small bundle of letters tied with plain string. And beneath all of it, at the very bottom of the drawer, a banker's passbook. Holmes picked up each item in turn, read it with the focused speed of someone who knows what they are looking for, and can navigate a document to find it, and set each down carefully in the order he had found them. Then he stood for a moment with his hands behind his back, looking at the open drawer. The documents were exactly what he had expected them to be. The original will of the elder Rucastle, leaving Alice's inheritance in trust. The power of attorney executed 18 months ago in Jeffro Rucastle's favour. 4 letters from the Southampton solicitor confirming income drawn against Alice's estate, and the passbook showing in neat columns the withdrawals made against an account that was not Jeffro Rucastle's, and yet bore beside every entry his initials. He photographed none of this because he had no camera. He memorized it, which served the same purpose. Then he took the documents, wrapped them in his coat, tucked them under his arm, and left the study exactly as he had found it. The west wing corridor was on the ground floor, reached through a door that was, as Violet had correctly identified, fitted with a newer lock, whose brass fittings were bright against the older wood. Holmes produced the small case again. 20 seconds this time. He opened the door. Beyond it was a short corridor, plainly decorated, no carpet, no pictures, ending in a second door that stood slightly ajar. He moved to it and knocked, quietly, twice. A pause. Then a voice, low, careful, with a steadiness in it that suggested the steadiness had been hard-won and was being maintained deliberately. "Who is there?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes," Holmes said. "I am here with Miss Hunter's knowledge. You have nothing to fear from me." Another pause, longer. Then the door opened. Alice Rucastle was 26 years old, and looked both younger and older than that, in the way of people who have been kept in one place for a long time, younger in her face, which was pale and fine-featured and unlined by weather, older in her eyes, which had the particular quality of someone who has spent a great deal of time thinking, and very little time doing, and has made the most of the former. She was thin, but not alarmingly so. She was dressed neatly, in a plain grey dress. Her hair was pinned up with the careful precision of someone who has maintained appearances for their own sake, as an act of private dignity, when there was no one watching who required it. She looked at Holmes for a moment. "I expected Miss Hunter," she said. "Miss Hunter is occupied at present," Holmes said. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the door. The room was small and clean, and had been made as habitable as possible within its constraints. Books on a shelf that Violet had not been able to see from outside, a writing desk with paper and ink, a window, the curtained one, with a chair positioned just far enough from it to see the lane below while remaining invisible from it. On the writing desk, beside the ink, was a Bradshaw's railway guide. Holmes set the documents on the desk beside the railway guide. Alice Rucastle looked at them for a moment without touching them. Then she sat down, picked up the power of attorney instrument, and read it from first line to last, with the absolute attention of someone reading a thing they have known existed for a very long time, and are finally, at last, permitted to hold. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Holmes. "Is it enough?" she said. "With a solicitor," Holmes said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The cloud outside had finally made its decision, and rain began against the window, soft, steady, the fine and patient kind. "Miss Hunter," Alice said. "She knew, didn't she, from the beginning?" "From very nearly the beginning," Holmes said. "She is a perceptive young woman." Something moved in Alice Rucastle's face, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one, the muscles that make a smile, remembering what they are for. "The ribbon on the sill," she said. "She mentioned the ribbon," Holmes agreed. "I knew then," Alice said. I thought perhaps I was wrong. I have been wrong before, about people." She touched the edge of the document with one finger. "I was not wrong." "No," Holmes said. "You were not." The rain continued its soft work on the glass. Downstairs, in the morning room, Watson was explaining to Mrs. Rucastle, whose own careful stillness had been dissolving, gradually, in the warm and uncomplicated presence of a man who was simply asking what was true and listening when she answered, that there were things that could be done properly through the proper channels, and that it was not too late, and that she need not be afraid of what came next. And in the hallway, where she had stationed herself at the foot of the stairs with the natural authority of someone who belongs in a house and knows it, Violet Hunter listened to the rain arrive and felt, for the first time since the letter with its strange conditions had come through Mrs. Penhaligon's door on a Tuesday morning, the particular and unmistakable sensation of a thing resolving, not ending, resolving. The difference mattered. Mr. Rucastle returned at 3:30 to find his study undisturbed, his household apparently in order, and a visiting physician just departing. He shook Watson's hand in the drive with his reliable warmth, and said he hoped the call had been satisfactory. Watson said it had been very satisfactory indeed. He drove away down the lane without looking back, because there was nothing, as far as Jeffro Rucastle knew, to look back at. He would discover otherwise on Thursday, when the solicitor arrived from Southampton. But that was Thursday. For now the Copper Beeches stood in the rain and caught what light remained in the November afternoon, and the house settled into its evening quiet. And in the west wing a woman sat at her desk with the documents Holmes had left her, and began carefully to make a list of everything she intended to say. Thursday came with clear skies. The rain had moved on. Overnight, leaving the world washed and precise. The gravel drive raked clean by the rain's passage, the Copper Beeches stripped a little further toward their winter bare, their remaining leaves catching the pale November sun with a brightness that had something final and unhurried about it, the brightness of a thing that knows it is nearly done and has decided to be beautiful about it. Violet noticed the light from her window at 7 in the morning while she was dressing, and paused for a moment with one button undone to look at it. Then she finished dressing and went down to breakfast. The solicitor arrived at 11. His name was Mr. Ford, and he was a compact grey-haired man from Southampton who carried his briefcase with the specific purposefulness of someone who has been told what is required of him and has come prepared to provide it. Holmes had met him briefly in the hallway. Holmes had stayed the night at the Winchester Inn, and returned that morning on the early trap, arriving before Rucastle came down, and the two of them had conferred for perhaps 10 minutes in the eat parlour before Ford went upstairs to the west wing, and Holmes came to find Watson in the morning room. "Well?" Watson said. "He's seen the documents," Holmes said. "He agrees they constitute grounds to challenge the power of attorney. The income drawn against Alice's estate over 18 months is recoverable in principle, though in practice it will depend on what remains of it. He sat down and accepted the coffee Watson had waiting. Mrs. Rucastle had been quietly, carefully helpful that morning, producing coffee and a plate of bread and butter, with the manner of someone who has decided which side of a line they are on, and feels, on balance, relieved by the decision. The challenge will take time. These things always take time. But the instrument itself can be suspended pending review, which means Rucastle's authority over Alice's affairs ceases effectively today. Watson was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know yet," he said. "He will know," Holmes said, "when Ford presents the documents and the suspension notice at approximately 11:30. He looked at his watch. 14 minutes. Watson looked toward the hallway. "Should we be present for that?" he said. Holmes considered. "No," he said. "Ford is entirely capable, and our presence would make it theatrical, which it does not need to be." He picked up his coffee. "It needs to be legal. Legal is better." They heard Rucastle's voice at 20 minutes to 12. Not the words, just the voice, raised above its habitual geniality into something raw and less managed. The voice of a man whose cheerfulness has been structural rather than genuine, and has therefore collapsed quite suddenly when the structure was removed. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then it stopped. Then there was the sound of a door. Then silence. Watson and Holmes sat with their coffee and did not go into the hallway. Mrs. Rucastle appeared in the morning-room doorway at 10 minutes to 12. She was pale and composed, and had the expression of someone who has been holding a great deal of weight for a long time, and has just been told they may set it down. "Mr. Ford would like to speak with you both," she said, "when you have a moment." "Of course," Watson said. She withdrew. Holmes set down his cup. Watson straightened his coat. They went into the hallway in the manner of men who have somewhere specific to be, and are not in a hurry to get there. Ford dealt with everything that needed dealing with in the efficient, unhurried manner of a good solicitor, who has prepared his papers in advance, and is not susceptible to being rushed or deflected. He required Holmes's and Watson's signatures as witnesses to 2 documents. He provided Alice Rucastle with a written summary of her position and her immediate rights. He gave Mrs. Rucastle his card, and suggested, quietly, that she might wish to seek her own advice in due course. Mr. Rucastle was not present for any of this. He had gone into the study and closed the door, and the door had remained closed, and no one had gone to open it, and that seemed, by unspoken agreement, to be the appropriate arrangement for the moment. Violet gave her notice that afternoon. She found Mrs. Rucastle in the kitchen garden, the garden Mrs. Rucastle had stood looking at on all those absent mornings, the turned winter beds and the bare espalier apple trees against the south wall. And she told her, with perfect courtesy and a genuine gentleness, that she would be leaving on Friday morning, and hoped that the disruption was not too great an inconvenience. Mrs. Rucastle looked at her for a moment. "You knew," she said, "from very early on." "I suspected," Violet said. "I wasn't certain until the 3rd week." Mrs. Rucastle was quiet, looking at the apple trees. Then she said, "She is my husband's daughter, not mine. I have not always known how to." She stopped, started again. "I am glad it has ended this way. I want you to know that." Violet looked at her carefully. There was something in Mrs. Rucastle's face that she had been trying to read since the first day. that careful stillness that could mean self-possession or unhappiness. And she thought now that she understood it at last. It was neither, precisely. It was the stillness of someone who's known a thing is wrong for a long time, and has not known how to say so, and has therefore said nothing, and has lived with the cost of that silence in a way that showed, if you knew what to look for, around the eyes. "I know," Violet said. She said it simply, without judgment. Mrs. Rucastle looked at her once more, briefly, and then looked back at the apple trees, and they stood together for a moment in the pale November garden, with nothing more required of either of them. She packed that evening. It was a task she knew well, the systematic, efficient packing of a woman who has moved often enough to have developed a method. And she did it with the particular calm that comes from having decided something and acted on it, and found the action equal to the decision. Her books went first, wrapped in the blouse she didn't need until London. Her writing case next, closed and latched. Her dresses folded the way Mrs. Penhaligon's predecessor had taught her years ago, in a house in Dorset that she barely remembered now, except for the folding. She took the blue dress from the wardrobe. She held it for a moment, the good wool, the electric blue that had been chosen not for her, but for its resemblance to someone else's wardrobe, the dress that had been a costume before she had turned it into something else entirely. She folded it and left it on the chair. It was not her dress. She had no need to take it. She took the miniature of her mother from the mantelpiece, wrapped it in a clean handkerchief, and placed it at the very top of the trunk where it would not be pressed. Then she closed the trunk, latched it, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment. The room looked already as though she had never been in it. She supposed that was the nature of rented rooms and borrowed positions. They received you and released you, and retained almost nothing of the transaction. The house would go on. The Copper Beeches would stand at the gate through the winter and leaf again in spring. Edward would have another governess, and would watch her with his flat, evaluating eyes, and would ask her strange and possibly very good questions about spiders. Alice Rucastle would begin the slow, careful work of reclaiming her life. That, Violet thought, was the thing that mattered. That was the thing that would persist. Holmes and Watson walked with her to the trap the following morning. It was early, the light barely established, the frost still on the gravel, the Copper Beeches standing in the cold blue air with their near bare branches very still. Watson carried her trunk to the trap with the cheerful efficiency of a man who considers this entirely within his remit and requires no thanks for it. Holmes stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the house in the way he sometimes looked at concluded things. Not with satisfaction, precisely, but with the particular attention of someone making sure the ending is correctly observed. "You did well," he said, when Violet came down the front steps. Coming from Holmes, Watson knew, this was the equivalent of a considerable speech. Violet looked at him for a moment. "You joined me," she said. "That is what I will remember. Not that you saved anything. That you joined." Holmes considered this, which was to say he was quiet for 3 seconds, in a way that suggested genuine consideration rather than mere pause. Then he said, "Yes, that is a fair account of it." Watson helped Violet into the trap. The driver clicked to the horse. The gravel crunched. She looked back once as the trap turned into the lane, at the house, at the Copper Beeches, at the two figures standing in the drive, one of them raising a hand briefly in farewell. Then the lane curved, and the trees closed behind her, and the Copper Beeches was gone. The road to Winchester opened ahead, pale and clear in the morning frost. The train south was at 8:30. She had a new position beginning the following Monday, arranged the previous week, terms entirely her own, salary negotiated without apology. The family was in Hampstead, 2 children, both young. The letter had described them as lively, which Violet had learned to interpret with appropriate caution. But the house sounded good, and the mother's correspondence had the quality of someone who meant what she said. She watched the Hampshire countryside move past in the early light. The frosted fields, the bare hedgerows, the occasional farmhouse with its first smoke, rising thin and straight in the cold, still air, and felt quietly and completely the specific satisfaction of a person who's done a difficult thing well and knows it, and requires no further confirmation of the fact. The trap's wheels found their rhythm on the road. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. Somewhere behind her, in a locked room that was no longer locked, a woman was sitting at a writing desk with the morning light coming through an open curtain for the first time in 18 months, making her list, beginning her sentences, choosing her words with the careful deliberateness of someone who has had a long time to think about what they wish to say and is finally, at last, permitted to say it. The train was waiting. Violet Hunter settled her bag on her lap, turned her face toward Winchester, and did not look back again.